Works better if I turn it on. Good morning. So I didn't see show of hands. Who's been to a DevOps Days before? Who's been to more than one? Okay, Andrew, stop showing your hand. Who's been to more than 10? Andrew burned, Mina, yeah. I stopped counting. Because I'm one of those people who gets asked way too much to talk about this, and one of the topics that each time comes up is there a future for DevOps? Even yesterday evening, I was trolled with that question. So who am I? I'm KRIS BUYTAERT. About 20 years ago, I started out my career as a software developer in back then Java, Perl, moved to PHP, then kind of became the only guy who knew how to cluster an application, how to rack a machine, so I turned to be an ops guy. For the past 11 years, I've been helping organizations to build infrastructures and deploy software using open source tools. I co-founded a small consulting company, it's called Inuits, and somewhere along that journey, I met a lot of people. And Andrew met a lot of people, and Patrick met a lot of people, and we started this small thingy called DevOps Days. So if we talk about DevOps, there's always the question, what is DevOps? And everybody has his own definition. Everybody has a definition that varies slightly from other people, but for me still this is one of the best definitions around. When Damon Edwards and John Willis were doing their podcast called DevOps Cafe, well, they're actually still doing it, they started interviewing a lot of people who, for them, were doing this DevOps thing. And each time the conversation was about culture, it was about automation, it was about measuring, and it was about sharing. And those 4 or 5 components, if you add the lean movement and the influences, those are pretty much what sums up the discussions we have when we talk about DevOps. This was actually another definition. You'll see I'll be using a bunch of old slides because this is a slide from the deck I used with Patrick back in 2010 at DevOps in Antwerp. And there we said, well, it's a global movement which is trying to improve the quality of software delivery, which we started again back in 2009. And it's built on 3 main components, and the 3 main components is what we looked at when we had the first DevOps Days in Ghent. There were basically groups from these 3 origins. It was people who were really vested in open source, people who had done open source for over a decade, were contributing to a lot of projects, were building infrastructures leveraging it, and there was one big group. And then the other group was people from the Agile movement. I mean, that's where Patrick met Andrew the year before, and a couple of other people. And now on top of that group, there were people who were at that moment starting to adopt cloud. We were having discussions on how to build our own private clouds, comparing the tools, and people were explaining how they were actually adopting EC2 in those early days. And if you group those 3 influences together, that's where the first group started from. That's where the DevOps foundations were put. We started the conference, as I said, in Ghent by accident. Small group, about 70 people. And that idea was great. The format was great. One of the key components of that format was open spaces, which you'll get to experience in the afternoon. And people liked it, and they went home and they said, hey, this was the best conference ever. And they wanted to do another one. So we did another city. We moved to Hamburg. And then we moved to Mountain View, and to Göteborg, and to Boston, and things started growing. And after a couple of years, somewhere in 2012, the turning point happened, which is when we were actually, well, Patrick and me were actually the last one in Rome where we said we're going to run this one as a European one, and then there's going to be a lot of cities, because London was calling, Paris was calling, Amsterdam started. And as of then, every city with a community wanted to run their own DevOps Days. And even you guys are running the 3rd year in a row, which is great. So where's DevOps Days heading? I mean, this slide is outdated already. We had 175 events in 2017. Monday evening, I was kicking off the team from Portugal, and in the Slack channel, we had 600 people discussing how to organize one of these events. There were more than 50 events scheduled for this year. This week alone, we actually have 3 events going on right at this moment, actually even within the same time zone. London is kicking off, Cape Town is kicking off, and we had Cairo earlier this week. So that's 3 DevOps days going on right now, which is crazy. So something happened. Something happened with this movement that people want to come to these kind of events and discuss topics. And that's the scary part, because we're 10 years down the road, and we're still having these discussions. People ask me, is there a future? And we have this amount of events happening, so there must be something. So I want to take a step back and look at how we got here. And it's probably because I'm a grumpy old system administrator, because I'm still frustrated that things are not working the way we preach they should be working. And yes, I'm opinionated or experienced. Depends on what you call it. But we need to look at history, because we've all learned that history repeats, and we need to learn from our mistakes. We need to understand where we failed and what we did wrong in order to improve those things. So the things I like to look at is the evolutions of the open space topics. There used to be a time where I actually could walk into a DevOps days and predict the topics people were going to propose, because every city, every group had the same discussions. So let's have a look at those open space topics. When we started our DevOps days, the discussions were, when we talked about culture, it was, how do you do Agile? How do you do Kanban in an operations team? What's the influence of Lean? Those discussions have evolved. What we see now is that we're discussing how fake Agile has been adopted. How people who claim to be Agile aren't actually Agile. They've implemented frameworks like the Scaled Agile framework, which is the fine, comfortable zone for management to not have changed anything, but now the developers have stand-ups and sprints, and they can use ticketing systems. But fundamentally, nothing has changed. In the early days, we looked at startups as examples. And then we started moving to, hey, but what about the enterprise? How does the enterprise do this? And if you look at the topics the last couple of years of DevOps days, we're not talking about examples anymore. We're talking about culture, we're talking about, but we don't have good examples anymore of organizations that are really doing a great thing. I hope somebody's not on call now, because, well, I am, but. And we moved from success stories and unicorns. These were the poster childs. We looked at how Etsy was doing. And everything was great. And the topic started to evolve to, how do you deal with failure? How do you learn from failure? And sadly, a really popular topic became burnout. People who were trying to change their organizations, but were actually getting so frustrated that they couldn't work anymore. Those were not happy topics. If we looked at automation, we saw different evolutions. Yes, we spent way too much time discussing whether we should use Chef or Puppet or CF Engine or any other tool. It were fun technical discussions to have in a bar. And by the way, the answer to that question is yes, use one of them. I don't care which one, as long as you don't do it manual. And what we see now is a discussion move to, well, we're rewriting bash scripts in YAML. Or we're using YAML for something else. We use from really great orchestration tools to another set of orchestration tools. This is where there's still evolution happening. We used from continuous integration tools to a variety of continuous integration tools. And people were actually not liking the original ones anymore. People started to improve and started to evolve. So there's great evolution. Where there's little evolution, however, is when we first started out, there was one big proprietary vendor and a lot of potential open source solutions where we're actually going to work as private clouds. Today, there is a lot of proprietary solutions and not that much open source solutions anymore. Building a private cloud is not that trivial. It's too complex. When we talked about virtualization, we talked about Xen, about KVM, about OpenVZ, about LXC, about vServers, about... And somewhere along that journey, we started talking about only one thing. Docker, 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 Docker. And for some people, that solved everything. And for a lot of other people, that actually made the problem bigger. When 7, 8 years ago, we were teaching developers how to work on a platform that we could use and reproduce and use in acceptance and use in production, basically we moved back to, it works on my machine, it works on my container. It's an ops problem now. And we didn't learn from what we did before. We used to think about service orchestration, about scalability, about high availability, about resilience, and we were talking about tools like Linux HA, CoreSync, Pacemaker. Even before that, we were doing distributed systems using tools like OpenMosix. And if you look at all those components, like group a number of resources together, define co-location, I need at least that amount of resources to do this, we're doing exactly the same. Only now we call those resource group pods. And it's Kubernetes, and there's containers underneath rather than processes. But there's nothing that has changed. Some algorithms have improved, but we're still having those same discussions. We looked at distributed file systems. Luckily, SUP and Gluster and stuff's way approved. But sadly, when we walk into the average enterprise, their solution for distributed storage is a solution we abandoned a decade and a half ago. It's network failure system. NFS. I mean, how did we end up having that as a default again? And we can go on. I mean, we improved in testing. We improved in version control. We realized that master-only development is the only way to go and that feature branches are evil. We've solved a lot of the release management topics, but not all of them. And when I say we solved, it means that a lot of people in our industry know how to deal with it, but not everyone understands these things yet. So we need to keep on teaching how test-driven development works. We need to keep on teaching that security testing is part of our ecosystem. And luckily, the last couple of years, we've seen a huge improvement in the involvement of the security industry. Although that's not new, because we did those talks already back in the early days. Has monitoring evolved? Who still thinks monitoring sucks? Andrew. Who besides Andrew is awake? Don't make me go to who's a human being. Sarah, where did you put me? These are not human beings. Or they're all still asleep. Give them some coffee. So monitoring used to be something really awkward. John Vincent on Twitter launched the hashtag monitoring sucks, and we all agreed. We didn't like monitoring. It was bloated. There was a lot of tools that didn't do what you want. If we wanted to do metrics and aggregation, we needed to have a full-time DBA to run our cacti setup. And that's where we did a huge shift. We've got really new great tools now. We now know how to do metrics at scale. We now know how to collect those things. And each couple of years, there's new tools that adapt to our new ecosystems. And now a lot of people have found a new love for monitoring. Partly because they've automated everything, partly because there's less false positives, because they had time to tune the false positives out because they automated everything. And you see that the open space discussions have been a lot about those tools, because it's easy to talk about those tools. It's easy to discuss which ones you like and which ones you hate. But it's much more difficult to go to the real hard topic. And that real hard topic is culture. And the tooling hype we currently have is not helping to this. Yes, there's 400 or 500 people here, but how many people go to a DockerCon? How many people go to a KubeCon? There's many more going there to look at the tools and look how they can implement new fancy things, where they then find out that the actual problem the organization has is fixing their culture. And it's not just us, it's also the vendors. A lot of the vendors within the ecosystem are trying to sell DevOps. They're trying to make it into a product, which is impossible. You can't buy DevOps. It's something you need to do. It's a journey. But as Ken Nuggrage, one of the other core DevOps Days organizers, says, well, you cannot buy it, but you might need to actually sell the ID to your organization. You might need to talk to your peers and talk to your colleagues and say, hey, we need to change, we need to do this thing differently. And that's selling the ID. So we look at the history. And you might think, well, this looks all good. Why would there not be a future? There's still a lot of work to be done. And the reason why I think there's sometimes a lot of discussion is because as an industry, the IT industry is really good at ruining great things. And I'll give you some examples. Who likes ITIL? Okay, I know you guys are asleep, so. ITIL is a really great library of books with great ideas in there. Doesn't mean you need to implement all of it, but you can learn from it. And you can take bits and pieces and say, hey, this is interesting. Let's implement this our way. But that's not how it's perceived anymore. It's perceived these days as the last mile. The group of people who basically say, no, we're not going to do this. The people who sit in a useless meeting at 10 a.m. on a Friday morning deciding about what goes through production. The people who literally take the book as a procedure and don't actually understand anymore what the goal was, what the idea was. They tune down the idea from the best practice to a set of good practices. And those practices are still good. But somebody whose job today is to just follow all the rules and decide on the rules basically gave a bad idea to the concept. But if you start talking to those people and you see, hey, what's the goal you're trying to achieve? What are you actually trying to do? And try to understand their language, you'll understand that what they want to do is improve stability, is improve quality, which is exactly what we want to do as a DevOps movement. Only we're automating everything, and we're doing 1,000 or 10,000 times the speed that manual processes do. But ITIL is dead. It died. Is Agile dead? Well, to a lot of the Agile purists, Agile is dead because it's been superseded by people who claim they've implemented Agile, but actually aren't understanding what the word Agile means. There's so many people who have seen broken Scrum setups and companies who claim to do Agile, but they've never actually experienced Agile. So yes, they hate it. Yes, they hate the procedural format of how to run a sprint, because it's a procedure. And they haven't understood anymore where it really is about. So even with a manifest up front that says people over process, a lot of people consider this movement dead. They fail to understand that it's about empowering teams. They fail to understand that there's more methodologies around there that can make an organization agile. And that discussion needs to happen again. Is open source dead? I don't think it's dead, but a lot of people think it is, because we've seen so many interpretations of the word open. Exactly the same which happened with the word DevOps happened years before with the word open. Hey, this is nice. The marketing folks jump on, stamp open on it, and say, hey, this is open source. Not understanding it. Not actually implementing true open source. Not creating communities around it. But just trying to use it as a marketing gimmick. And we end up with things like Open Core. We end up with things like the OpenStack Foundation, where there is only vendor interest and actually no contributions. Exactly the same is happening with DevOps, and we need to try to prevent that. But if we can identify where the pain points are, maybe it's going to be a little bit easier. So the first group of people is us, the people who've been talking about this. For years, my most requested talk was 7 tools for your DevOps stack. And I lost count how many times I gave that talk. Bernd, do you know? How many times did you see it? Too much. And the whole thing of that talk was, I have the 7 tools in my pocket, and the last 5 slides are about, these tools don't matter. It's about the human being. It's about the people working together. Guess which thing most people forgot? That conclusion, that it was about the people. They came back the year later and said, hey, I implemented all of the 7 tools you talked about. But it was the 8th tool that was important. We had those discussions about puppet versus chef. We looked at all the tools. And we implemented all the tools. And then there were the recruiters. They started hiring DevOps engineers and putting them in DevOps teams. I still don't know what a DevOps engineer is. I mean, is that a guy who writes code, or is that a girl who manages machines? Or is that the person who's in charge of the tooling? I don't know. But the recruitment industry, and there's a quote from Serge van Ginderechter, who basically calls the recruitment industry a bunch of pimps, and said, well, they call me a DevOps engineer, because that's where they get money from. But we don't like the term. Ken, again, he actually found the best ad for DevOps engineer. £0 salary, because it isn't actually a job. Kind of makes sense. And we put those DevOps engineers in DevOps teams. Is that the team running tooling? Is that the team in charge of delivery? I mean, most of the organizations I walk into are basically putting DevOps teams in between development and operations, adding another silo, adding another layer of confusion, so that those people now become the people to blame. One of my other favorite ones. I see at least 1 certified DevOps engineer in the room, Bernd, probably more. The thing is, if you read carefully, this is what we did at DevOps Days again, the 5th anniversary. He's actually a master in DevOps certified by the University of Dev and Oops. I have to admit, DevOps Days Berlin, by Bernd, by the way, trolled us the month before by handing out certificates. And they have another glitch to it. You need to renew your certificate every year. Because, I'm sorry, but I cannot certify you people for not being assholes. Because fundamentally, that is what DevOps is about. And everybody who claims to be able to do so, well, I'm not sure if I believe them. So this certification thing, it happened before. ITIL made it into a procedural language. Most of the Scrum certified people I know have their Scrum certification hanging right next to their Prince2 certification. They're still doing the same thing, but now they call it Agile. And let's realize it, certifications are typically things for vendors to get more money from you. So how do you even certify a thing like DevOps? I mean, even one step worse, there's people who try to standardize DevOps, as if it would work for everybody the same way. If that would work, a bunch of us would be millionaires by now. If we could actually write a book and say, if you do these, and these steps, it's all going to work? It's not going to work. Because it's about culture, it's about human beings working together. And the sales and marketing people, they broke it. They tried to sell off DevOps tools. They tried to sell off certified DevOps tools. And the ultimate DevOps tools. We've seen the marketing campaigns, the ultimate DevOps tools. So it's hard. DevOps is hard. I'll be honest with you. And people don't like to do hard things. Change management is hard. Because what you want to do is change the way your organization collaborates. And there's going to be 20% of people who say, hey, this is awesome, I want to do this. I want to work exactly that way. And those are your early adopters. Then there's going to be 60% of people who say, nah, we've done this before. It's going to be the same. And in a lot of organizations, they're absolutely true. And then there's going to be the 20% who says, nope, I'm not doing this. I'm not going to change. The successful DevOps adoptions I've seen is where they actually fired those 20% on the spot. I've not seen that happen too much. But it does happen. But it's hard. And enterprise DevOps, I don't even like the word because we started out, well, basically Patrick and me, I was working for a large telco equipment manufacturer. Patrick was working for governments. So for us, it was already enterprise when we started talking about these topics. The enterprise people say, well, you can only do this in small organizations, which is not true. But it takes much longer to change a large organization because you have much more people to teach. You have much more people to change how they behave. And when you see that happen, you see that the resistance is higher because there's a much larger group. And you see that people need multiple waves. The first wave is going to get to a certain level and they burn out or leave because they're not happy about the speed. And then the second group comes in and they do some change. And then at some point the antibodies kick in. Michael Brunton-Spall from, where is he? GDS? No, he's not at GDS anymore. Or yes, doesn't matter. He called it the antibodies kicking, like a human body. When bacteria start to attack the body start to react. Same happens with organizations. The thing with these DevOps enterprise thing is that naming things is hard. We have discussions about what DevOps means. They have them too, and sometimes they get lost in those discussions. So one of the tips I give people is don't call it DevOps when you do it. Call it engineering 2.0. Call it fast delivery. Call it stable delivery. Call it whatever you like. Call it service reliability engineering. But set your goals and figure out what you as an organization want to do and move forward. Also, don't call it the Spotify model. The Spotify model was a snapshot in time of self-steering teams that were end-to-end capable of doing things and how they needed to communicate better with each other, which is something completely different from a traditional matrix organization, which most organizations implement if they do Spotify. They still have their own old team managers who are now basically the product owners. Hierarchically, they haven't changed anything. And that's the enterprise side. On the other side, we also see issues. I've become a big fan of the term YOLO engineering because that's what I see a lot these days. Startups where are basically selling to their venture capitalists with no actual users and thinking about their exit strategy, they have no value in building a resilient platform. They just spin up stuff and whatever. If it crashes in 3 months, well, we don't know if we're around in 3 months. Which is completely different from the culture where you have an actual business, where you have real customers, where you need to survive. You want to build in resilience, you want to build in stability. And the way people look at new tools and spin up test environments and basically call them production because, well, it doesn't really matter to them is not something we should look at as an example. So we're 9 years down the road, almost 10. We're going to celebrate the 10th year edition of DevOps Days again next year, hopefully. And when I walk into an organization, I still see this. I used to have this slide titled The Old Days, because at a Friday evening at 5 p.m., you walked into an ops room and said, hey, here's a tarball, can you put this in production? I need this site live because there's a live radio campaign going on at 7. And a lot of things have changed, but the thing that hasn't changed is that practice. It's not a tarball anymore, it's a Docker container. But all the problems and all the discussions around it are equally the same. We still enough machines to run them up, we still enough databases, we still enough security, backups. The discussion is still going on. There's new tools, there's new people in there, but we're fundamentally having the same discussion over and over again. So yes, there is a future. It's not an easy one. It's not the one some of us would like it to be. But the first thing for that future is teaching people about our mistakes. Taking away those guns so they can't shoot in their foot again. Because we've already experienced that pain. We know what it feels like to have to deploy something fast at 5 p.m. on a Friday. And then stay awake all night because it's failing and failing and failing. We don't want to do that over again. We want to teach people what we did to improve that. And it's going to be a long journey. And small organizations can adapt much faster than large organizations. But going on that journey, if you don't realize it's going to be at least 2 to 5 years as your organization, don't start. Lots of people who start doing this DevOps transition stop after 6 months because it's not working. Because they've only seen the small sparkles. They see there's things happening, but are nowhere even close where they want to be. And like I said before, there's sometimes 2, 3 waves of people that need to come in to do these things. And people are going to burn out. So it's going to be a long journey. But the journey continues. We need to teach people. The organization you started out at 10 years ago was young, was 5 people. Now it's a 100-person organization with different challenges, different patterns to be learned. And we often forget to bring over our culture. We often forget to teach people how we work. We just drop them there and say, hey, you'll absorb everything. But the bigger you grow, the more time you need to spend in actually telling people how you work. So that's also going to be a challenge. The culture you had 5 years ago is not going to be the same culture you have in 5 years. Things will evolve, just as technology will evolve. You can do great and awesome things with containers, but you can also fuck them up. And you need to learn what we took from the original days and say, hey, resilience, repeatability, idempotency, all of those topics, and translate them to the new technologies. That's going to be a challenge. So our new roles will be teachers, both for the suppliers we work with and for the people we work with. We're going to be students because we're going to constantly be learning things. New technology, so we need to adapt. Our role is going to be much broader than what it used to be before. Yes, we're going to need to go back to mathematics to really learn about those statistics and really know how that platform behaves. And if you're an ops guy, you're really going to need to learn how to write code again. And if you're a girl who writes code, you're going to need to understand what the developers, what the ops folks are doing, so they actually will accept your code. You're going to need to learn how to troubleshoot. You're going to need to learn how to build bridges between groups and share out that message and bring that message. And sometimes you're going to have to be a shrink, listen to people on what their problems are and try to help them. You're going to have to change your job. Someone at Google once said, every 18 months you need to automate yourself out of your job. That's still true. Might be 2 years, might be 6 months. But our role will be to adapt to the new ecosystems. And that's what DevOps is going to be about. It's not about those tools. It still is about driving that change into working together, driving that change into how people collaborate. It means we need to stand up against a couple of things. Not accept broken certification, not accept broken hiring processes. But eventually, DevOps is here to stay. New tools will pop up, new technologies will appear, but collaborating across different skill sets is the biggest thing we need to do. The future is here, and it's just not evenly distributed. And maybe it never is going to be. Thank you.
So we have time if you have any questions. Yeah.
Cool.
Hi, my name is Kıvılcım Ministan. I'm from Vengers. I'd like to ask a specific thing. What I'm seeing through all this DevOps movement is that we are losing the notion of sizing up things. It is like we came up with the monkey wrench. We solved the monkey wrench for the first time, and we are using it for everything. I mean, as for the size of the problem, as for the size of the complexity, no, doesn't matter. We use the monkey wrench. Each and every day I see that some simple problems that can be solved by, let's say, SQLite are trying to be solved by Firebase. How do we come over this? Thank you.
So the question is, how do we solve the problem where people jump on the fancy new tools and the nice looking tools rather than just taking the obvious simple approach, right?
Yes.
I call that symptom resume-driven development or conference-driven development. I'm sorry, I have no fix for it apart from stopping organizing conferences. But I've seen that before. People just, they look at the, and in a way it's mostly developers who have that. They look at the new shiny fancy technology and they say, hey, I want to do this. And they jump on it without actually thinking about the consequence, without thinking about the impact. And then when you get peer review of people who have to run that stack in a later process, they start asking questions. Why? Isn't it more simple like this? How do you plan on doing this? Is this even mature enough? It to me partly is part of that gap where you need people who are involved in operations much earlier into that conversation of what you're going to build, how you're going to build, and which components you're going to use. Back in the early days of Etsy, the discussion and the topics John Alspaugh was talking about is he started with a small stack, only one stack. And everything needed to fit onto that stack because the operations team needed to be able to manage that stack and keep full control over that stack. And only when they had full control over that stack, they started to add more and more complexity and more components. And that's actually a pretty good approach. It, however, doesn't solve directly that you're not always using the right tool for the right job. You might be using a SQL database for something that's just a flat file. But at least it's something you can manage. The problem I see is that people, well, I want to do this NoSQL thing, and then 6 months down the road, you actually realize, but it's all structured data. Why are we putting this in a schemaless? And that's a topic we need to tackle as a group. When you have a cross-functional team, you need to have that discussion up front on why are you going to do this? Why do you want to select that tool? And if it basically means, well, that's a checkbox so I can get hired for my new gig, it's something you should try to fix. Like that's basically the broken hiring strategy you need to fix. More questions? Serhat, are you running around with the mic? There's somebody. Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Hello, this is Türker Aslan from Vodafone Turkey. My question will be about implementing the DevOps culture into an enterprise organization. So me and my team are really struggling to do such thing, and even like a pilot experience in such a big organization, which is kind of a, one of the first examples in the country. So what do you find the biggest challenges on implementing such thing?
Okay, so the question is what I find the biggest challenges when adopting DevOps in large organizations. And to me, the biggest challenge today is still that senior management talks the talk but doesn't walk the walk. They want to hire people and say we're doing DevOps so they can get better talent, but they don't actually want to change. And I've seen that in way too many organizations where, and the first symptom of that is, yeah, we're agile, and then, okay, so how's your agile? Well, we implemented the scaled agile framework. Okay, so you're not agile. You just have that nice, comfortable feeling of, we did something different, but we gave it new names, and it's still old wine, but it's in new. And that's the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge is to make sure that organizations really want to change. And if the top management and the bottom people on the floor, if they both want to change, then you got a chance. But if there's reluctance from senior management saying, well, those people have been wanting to do something different, we don't really like it, but we'll let them do it, it's not going to happen. And that's what I typically see in most organizations. The other big challenge is that senior management does want change, but they fail to communicate it. They have great ideas, they've got great plans, and when you talk to them, everything sounds perfect, but when you go on the floor and talk to people, they actually got a completely different message. They don't know what the goals are. So people have not been informed and we actually are going to do this. They just got some part of the message. We're going to do this thing now, we're going to do this thing now, without actually having the greater vision of completely changing the organizations. And those are two things that I've seen happen where you didn't see the organization move as fast as they would like to go.
We have time for one question. Yes.
Thank you. Hi. Sorry. I'm Burç. I'm a software architect, also a member of a DevOps team in a corporate company. We're having this issue about cross-functioning a team or a people who can do lots of things, or cross-functioning the members of the DevOps team. He's really confused about this situation, you know. Is it best way that the team should cross-functioning for the DevOps operations, or the any members can do lots of things, you know?
Okay.
It's kind of containerization, test automation, I don't know, other things.
So the question is, if you have a cross-functional team, should every member of the team have knowledge and experience in all the different components that team needs to cover, or does the team as a group needs to have all the skills? The answer for me is that the team as a group needs to have all the skills to be end-to-end responsible of delivering the software they're responsible for. That does, however, impact that people need to have awareness and try to understand the rest of their team members. So a developer, if he just cares about writing code and doesn't care about or doesn't want to understand the non-functional requirements, it's not going to work. It doesn't mean that he needs to know how to implement them, but he needs to understand and be able to collaborate with the other team members on how to provide metrics, on how to provide health status. So it is about collaborating. It's not about the one person who knows it all. The one person who knows it all is also sometimes laughed at as being the full stack engineer. And the full stack engineer to me is really the unicorn who has his name in the Linux kernel and did front-end development and everything in between. I mean, I can count the number of people who do that. And even though my name was in the Linux kernel back in 1997, I haven't touched it for 20 years. And I haven't done front-end. I understand the ranges about it, but I'm not going to do end-to-end the whole stack. And that is part of the discussion. I mean, I'm much, much more a fan of the dual stack engineer who really knows in depth his part of his field, knows how to collaborate with his colleagues, and then as a group is able to fulfill the end-to-end stuff.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.